Thank you, Sue.
Okay, this is Sense Making, a Challenge to Behavioural Insights, which is our title. And I'm Suzanne, and I'm going to talk to Sue today to get to the bottom of the concept of sense making. So Sue, can you first of all explain how the concept of sense making came into being?
Hi, I'm Sue. The idea of sense making has been working its way through my mind for a few years. I first of all chanced upon the work of Carl Weick, who developed a sense-making framework in organizational psychology, and I then went on to discover Gary Klein, who's a pioneer in the field of naturalistic decision-making. And then a lovely new book came out recently called Sense-Making by Christian Madsberg, which is very possibly not how you pronounce his name. Weick, Klein, and Madsberg all talk about sense-making in different ways, but there is a common thread.
Apart from difficult names.
Yes, there is that. Sense-making struck a chord with me because I've become increasingly frustrated with the way market researchers, or the market research discourse at least, treats, and behavioural economics and behavioural insights, hence the name of the title of this presentation, seems to ignore what real life is actually like. So that's why there's a challenge. It should come up now. Yes, and it's new. Apart from Christian, who's a business anthropologist, I don't know of any consumer researchers who've even looked at the idea of sense making. Look, I could be wrong, and I'd be happy to hear from anyone who's working on this.
So I'm feeling that sense making challenges the behavioural insights approach, which has become so deeply embedded really in the past decade. I'm thinking of the kind of interventionist experimental work done by governments under the heading of behavioural insights. The UK's Behavioural Insights Unit, for example, recently released a report called Improving Engagement with Pensions, which summarised 3 randomised control trials testing potential solutions to the problem that people don't read information about pensions.
Yes, both behavioural economics and behavioural insights have an unfortunate tendency to see the world in terms of problems. Sense-making draws on the same theory as BE and BI, but it treats people as people, not as problems.
But what does that mean, to treat people as people?
Well, I don't know about you, but sometimes I do things because I'm bored. Sometimes I do things because the opportunity came my way. But things like boredom and taking opportunities don't seem to get talked about in our world or in the BI world. And to give you another example, half the time I don't so much as make a decision as let an idea revolve in my head. Everybody does it. It's not a problem.
But we know from BE that we make system 1 decisions automatically, but we also make considered, effortful system 2 decisions. Is that something you disagree with then? I'm
not saying that people don't have a dual processing system. Of course they do. But I do think that relying on the concept of system 1 and system 2 to explain everything about the decisions people make as part of their everyday lives is a bad idea. For example, in real life, some ideas just come to you.
And they don't have an obvious start point or an obvious end point. And then they're neither considered nor automatic, are they?
Right. And what we call decision, a decision is not often that at all. Sometimes people decide because they need to figure something out. Sometimes people decide because they just want to get something done. People also bring a lifetime of experience to bear on the decisions they make. It's not just an evaluation of attributes happening in the moment, which is how I usually think of as an effortful, that is such a hard word, effortful system 2 decision.
So we're saying that's part of the sense-making idea, that there's a lot more to decision-making than we allow for.
Absolutely. Another key idea is that people have a drive to make things make sense. All anybody ever wants is for what they do to make sense.
Well, to themselves, if not to everybody else.
Look, I like this quote because it sums up the idea that people have a drive to make things make sense. So the drive for sense-making motivates people to gather, attend to, and process information in a fashion that augments and complements autonomous sense-making, explains curiosity, boredom, information avoidance, aesthetics, why we care about others' beliefs, the importance of narrative, and the role of the good life in human decision-making, and that comes from the Journal of Economic Behaviour and Organisation.
That also brings to the foreground the kind of ideas that we were just talking about, doesn't it? Things that happen in real life. So one of the phrases I often hear when I'm listening and talking to people in research is that makes sense, or that doesn't make sense. Is that the kind of sense making that you're talking about?
Yeah, they have a drive to want things to make sense, a sense-making drive. Chaos feels uncomfortable, so the drive to make sense is in many ways a pleasure-seeking drive, getting things sorted out, closure, that kind of thing. For example, we could think about retirees interested in pensions or superannuation from this pleasure-seeking closure perspective rather than the problem-solution perspective. You can apparently see sense-making happening in the brain when parts of the brain work together, that's the key point, to help us make sense of things. Apparently, neuroscience has shown that people make sense of complex situations using 9 different regions of the brain at the same time.
Well, I actually think this is a key point, that sense-making is about how people deal with situations.
Yes, behavioural economics and behavioural insight are about a fairly narrow form of decision-making. Sense-making is definitely about making sense of situations.
So you're not rejecting behavioural economics?
No, not at all. Sense-making and BE actually draw on the same cognitive and social psychology. It's just that sense-making takes that psychology and refocuses it to people as a whole living their lives, and it's just more positive.
So thinking still about behavioural economics, one of the important things it's taught us, or I guess reminded us, is that much of our thoughts and motivations are below conscious awareness.
Sense-making shares that belief. So yes, our brains automatically notice and process signs and cues, and then connect those cues to whatever mental models and expectations seem to best explain what's happening. Our culture, our experiences, our sense of identity are the things that create those mental models.
Okay, so give us an example.
Okay, imagine you are in an unfamiliar building and you hear a fire alarm. How would you make sense of what's happening and what you should do?
Well, from a BE perspective, we might think about the biases and heuristics that could be involved. So loss aversion might be in there, desire to follow normative behaviour might be in there, for instance.
Yes, but I think that raises more questions than it answers. Can it be both loss aversion and normative? If you wanted to save yourself, which I think is loss aversion, but everyone was sitting there doing nothing, social norms, which bias wins? But when we look at this from a holistic perspective, how people make sense of such an event, we can probably understand how people would respond to the fire alarm.
This is sounding a bit like qual. So how different is it from the qual we all know and love?
It is qual. It's qual about experiences, but it uses a sense-making framework to develop and conduct the research. So my contribution to sense-making has been to come up with the framework you can see on the left of the screen, specifically as a research framework.
And getting back to the fire alarm example, this lady is Heather, isn't she?
She is Heather.
She's very unsuspecting and a little bit of a panic having heard the alarm. Okay, so Heather would start to make sense of what's happening when she perceives relevant signs and clues. Is that right? Is that what we're saying?
Yes, they could be smoke and flames, or the sound of people moving or rushing, or just the sound of the alarm. So the first thing is that our brains interpret these signs and cues, the S in the model. To be clear, I'm talking about 2 types of sensory cues: the ones we consciously notice, like the smell of smoke or the sound of the alarm, and the superliminal stimuli, which is a term that Wendy Gordon has used, that we can notice, but we don't always. So it's liminal. Maybe the vibe in the room has changed. Maybe there's some tension in the air.
Dog gets that, doesn't he?
Oh, yeah, that's right. Look at the dog. Of course, there will be some things that we don't consciously notice as well. Recognize that. She, Heather, then sees all this through a frame of expectations, which is the E in the model. People see what they expect to see and sometimes adjust their mental model of the world to cope with what just happened. If she sees smoke and flames as well as hearing a fire alarm, she has a mental model built from experience to help her make sense of it. But what if she just heard the alarm and saw no smoke or flames? She may need to bring other factors to bear. And one of those factors could be paying attention to what other people do. The N is for social norms. So in the context of a fire alarm, if she sees other people running, she makes sense of what's happening to her as a fire. If everyone stays sitting at their desk, she may then create a mental model that says they have false alarms in this building. She follows the sheep. It's the picture. Yeah. Now, who you feel you are, your sense of self, the second S, will drive your behaviour. Does this fire alarm scenario bring back memories of previous fires or create aspirations of leadership or heroism? Then her sense of self will drive her behaviour, and the research needs to capture that sense of self. And then finally, emotion, which is the second E, making sense of things feels good. Failing to figure out what's going on feels bad. Imagine she made a mistake and didn't leave the building until the last minute.
So in other words, for all of these elements, sense-making research covers all of them and makes sense of them. Oh, Heather made it out okay. So what she did must have made sense to her. But how do we find out why she did what she did and how all those elements came together so her behaviour did make sense to her?
We can't test it and we can't be there, so we have to ask her. As Christian Madsberg has said in his book on sense making, if we want to truly make sense of our challenges, we must return to a process that seems old-fashioned. And for me, that's asking people. So we'd start by asking Heather about her experience, first of all listening to how she makes sense of it, and then we ask her questions based on the sense-making framework. Sense-making researchers need to be skilled at observing people and talking and listening to people. You need to observe the contextual cues that the person attended to, then listen to the person as he or she talks it through. I'm not talking about I am talking about high caliber research interviewing, the kind in which highly skilled researchers use good old-fashioned conversational probing, gently but persistently, unpicking the layers to reveal how and why what the person did made sense to them in human terms.
And what we are always trying to do as researchers is understand what it's like to be the other person in a good way.
I like Christian Madsberg's phrase, engaging with people at eye level. Sense-making research looks at the action, what people did and why they did it.
But so isn't that what all research aspires to do anyway, all good research?
Yes, but in sense-making, in a sense, we work backwards. We start with what happened. We take advantage of the fact that people make sense of what happened by constructing a narrative about it. Then we use conversational qual to identify the factors, the SE factors that came together to get that person to that point.
So let's have a summary then of the lessons that we can learn from using the sense-making framework.
Okay.
When we do our research in the future, what we can use.
Here they are on the screen. The lessons are to think about how people make sense of situations, not just how they make decisions. To think about people holistically, contextually, and culturally, living real lives. Let's not define people by their biases. And to reveal how sense-making occurred, work backwards from what happened to how it happened.
Well, it's nice to be talking about new ideas and research that are not tech for a change.
So thank you to NewMR for the opportunity.